Putin himself is a proud old Chekist. He takes great pride in the term Chekist, the Cheka being the first committee for the defense of the revolution under Felix Dzerzhinsky, famous Iron Felix, who said that we're committed to terror. His famous words were, "We are for organized terror." Putin's a huge fan of it. He talks about it all the time. I think it's part of him mythologizing their culture again.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Lobopac podcast. We are honored to have on the show former CIA case officer and author of his new book, Tradecraft, Tactics, and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War, Sean Wiswesser. Sir, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mike. Glad to be on with you and your listeners. Appreciate all the men and women who serve. So for an ROTC-focused audience like yours and others with your university, so it's an honor. Thank you.
Starting off, what went into creating the book as far as going through the CIA to get it, I guess, blessed off?
Yeah, so the book, when I retired from CIA, part of the process is they get to decide if I'm even allowed to affiliate with CIA, and so that took about a half a year. And I had this idea in the back of my head about a book, having studied at War College in the past sort of 5-6 years, end of my career. I got published on the Ukraine war, and I had this idea. They say, if you're going to write a book, write the one only you can write. I was a tradecraft expert. I retired as a member of our senior expert cadre in the DO, Director of Operations, and my specialty was Russian intelligence and their tradecraft. And so if I was going to write a book, Mike, that was going to be it. And then it was kind of a process, working with CIA on the drafts, seeing if they would clear it. And that's why the book is heavily cited. Those readers will note, there's hundreds of citations at the end of the book. And that was also to show CIA a lot of that is out there. It's to help the readers too. But to show them that a lot of this is unclassified. And then I added in sort of my analysis. And then what a lot of folks enjoy is the lived experience, which was one of the last things I added in. And I needed CIA to clear stories about actual Russian intelligence officers and other Russians that I'd worked with. So that was a little bit about the process.
Interesting. So you talk a little about in another interview that you started off in analysis and then you went into becoming a case officer. Is that typical, or do you generally get hired for one job, such as being an analyst?
Yeah, so for those of your folks, that are interested in the intelligence community, you're at the mercy of sort of who's available. Sorry, what agencies are available to you to apply. In the mid-90s, kind of like now, it was a time of downsizing. So not a lot of intelligence agencies were hiring in the mid-90s. CIA was one of them. They were hiring, but the Director of Operations was not hiring. So I started my career as an intelligence analyst, did that for a little bit in the intelligence community, kind of more broadly. Then I was a Foreign Service officer for about 6 years. Then I got my shot to go into the Director of Operations CIA for the rest of my career. So in short, I always give the advice to a lot of folks to take the job that's available to you, build a good reputation, do good work, and then move on to whatever else you can do.
Just moving into the book now. So I've read the whole thing, absolutely love it. But starting with chapter 3 about illegals, you mentioned the Ghost Stories case. Russians continue to use these operations to set up intelligence networks, but from what you share, it seems like these operations are, unfruitful. Why would the Russians continue to do operations like this, even though they're not getting bang for buck intelligence?
Yeah, so it's important. I note, Mike, I do note a lot of their failures, their incompetence, their indifference at times. They are fallible, the Russian intelligence services. That's throughout the book. Corruption is their greatest flaw. Of course, I spent a lot of time detailing that. But we also got to remember, in the case of espionage, it just takes one, right? It takes one really good case, and that can be a disaster for any government. And we've had those penetrations of the U.S. intelligence community and otherwise. So for the decades of the early Cold War, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russians had good success with illegals, enough to embolden them and make them believe in illegals. Remember that, as I detail in the book, the revolutionaries, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Dzerzhinsky, they were all familiar with illegal type tradecraft. Illegal and illegal in Russian comes from the concept of posing as a foreign citizen under a false passport, an illegal passport. And so they were familiar with that. They all had false identities. They were traveling abroad. Remember when the revolution happened, Lenin was sent in a sealed train by the Germans back to foment revolution. He was abroad, living abroad and hiding in exile. So they're committed to it. And Putin himself is a proud old Chekist. He takes great pride in the term Chekist, the Cheka being the first committee for the defense of the revolution under Felix Dzerzhinsky, famous Iron Felix, who said that we're committed to terror. His famous words were, "We are for organized terror." And so that's what they practiced, and they still do practice today with the FSB. So those traditions are, they run strong of the Chekist culture, and illegals are a part of them. Putin loves illegals. He tells stories that when he was a kid, he read the books by the Russian writer Yulian Semyonov, and one of them was a famous book made into a movie called 17 Moments of Spring. And Putin's a huge fan of it. He talks about it all the time. I think it's part of him mythologizing their culture again. But yeah, so illegals is something they're always going to come back to. They had success in it. The Manhattan Project utilized some illegals. One of the cases I talk about in the book is Rudolf Abel, an illegal named Fisher, whose family immigrated to the States. He went back after World War II. He was sent as an illegal to pick up the remnants of the Manhattan Project spy ring that the Soviets had great success with. And so they were the generation of what were called the great illegals. Nowadays, these are the not so great illegals. People like Anna Chapman that I point out, they're just riddled with failures, tradecraft incompetence. But the Russians are committed to illegals, and they're going to keep doing it. They're going to keep deploying them because they think ultimately it's a tradecraft practice that's worked for them.
Another thing you talk about in the book, you talk about how intelligence, like it's sort of as a joke, 3 different types of intelligence agencies go to collect intelligence about chemicals. And so the Russians go basically have a picnic and get drunk and then pick that up. Whereas like the PRC would send like 100 students to go pick up sand off of said beach. But have we seen the RIS as using more student focus like the PRC to try to get into different universities?
Yeah, sure. So the Russians have a term that Anna Chapman applied to her, applied to another case, Maria Butina, who was the guns rights activist, supposed that was sent as a Russian citizen to the United States. These are what the SVR calls special agent illegals. So it's a new kind of category, basically trying to do illegals and try to do deployment of intelligence officers on the cheap. They don't want to do the years of investment and resources that KGB Directorate S Chief Yuri Drozdov I talk about in the book. Mike, I'm sure you read that part of the book. You mentioned chapter 3. So Drozdov said it took 7-8 years to deploy an illegal properly, give them language training. I was a young fan of intelligence. In 6th grade, one of the first novels I ever read, books, was The Charm School by DeMille. It's a great book. It still is a great book. I read it in the 80s. It makes me feel old now. But it was about illegals. It was about this tradecraft tactic that they've always used, KGB, and now in modern times. So yes, the Russians will take advantage of students. They'll call them special agent illegals or just another type of deploying non-official cover officers that don't have diplomatic immunity, like Butina. When she was arrested, she went to jail. And so the Chinese do an awful lot of that, though, because they have, of course, millions of students around the world studying. At one point, we had hundreds of thousands of student visitors from China, and most of them are great students doing great research work and not spying, but an awful lot of them are also required to spy and go back and report to the Chinese government exactly what they learned and what their research was. So it's a huge problem for technology theft, which is the anecdote I relate that you mentioned from chapter 7 of the book. It's got nothing to do with whether they're nice people or not. It's got nothing to do with loyalty of dual citizens. I believe an American citizen is an American citizen. Until proven different, they're Americans. I married an immigrant myself. This has to do with, in China or Russia, you don't have a choice but to cooperate. It's coercion. It's state-sponsored coercion. You don't cooperate, you don't detail to us what you were learning and studying, you don't detail the research you were doing, you're going to jail. We'll arrest you, we'll arrest your family, we'll throw you in prison. That's autocracy. And so that's what it's really about. And it's a powerful intelligence technique.
But more on Russian agents, Sergei Tretyakov talks in his book, Comrade J, about RIS officers and how they comb through cemeteries looking for deceased people to try to resurrect and get their birth certificates. Have we seen other ways the RIS try to exploit the U.S., whether by going through different borders, maybe not the Canadian, maybe the Mexican-American?
Yeah, so what Sergei's mentioning there, and I mentioned in the book, I had the honor to debrief him in person and get to know him some. great tragedy when he died about 15 years ago. Sad for all of us that knew him and had the privilege to work with him. But yes, I commend to your readers his excellent book, Comrade J, with Pete Early. Pete Early's written a lot of great spy books. Another one is Confessions of a Spy about the Aldrich Ames case. I highly recommend it. I cite it in my own book quite a bit. So what Sergei is talking about is dead doubles. And most of the Russian illegals in 2010 that were wrapped up in the Ghost Stories case that I was honored to work on with FBI, and I also mentioned in my research, the dead double is when they find a child that had died in infancy. Oftentimes, the death records weren't reported before digitized records in the United States or Canada. And a lot of Russian Soviet illegals infiltrated via Canada, remember. And so what they would do is they would go with some type of documentation. Maybe it's as simple as library card and whatever they can get easily, simply without other IDs. They go and they show those to get another duplicate birth certificate, pretending they're that person, and that's how they can further the legend. So this is a technique still used. Accessing and manipulating birth certificates and records is absolutely still an SVR GRU technique. In Brazil, you'll recall, most of this came out after I wrote my book, but I do make a reference in the book to this big SVR spy network wrapped up in Brazil, where it appears the Russians have patience. Again, they're incompetent, they're corrupt, they have a lot of faults, but the one they sometimes have, and the Chinese for that matter, intelligence service, they have patience. It looks like what they did in Brazil is they embedded some false records into the system in Brazil before it was digitized, so decades ago. And the Brazilians didn't discover it until the Russians activated these personalities, these people within the system who had only had birth certificates. They had nothing else. And then all of a sudden, after 20, 30 years, this past decade, they started having other things that they were going out to get. Driver's license and then a passport. Once you got a passport, you're golden, right? And if you got a Brazilian passport as a Russian, illegal there, you can travel out of Brazil. They probably weren't interested as much in penetrating the Brazilian government as using that passport to go after the United States and other high-priority NATO targets, although they certainly would be interested, too, if they could penetrate the Brazilian government. It looks like it was being used as kind of a stopover. So, Mike, hopefully that answers the question. That's a little bit more the tradecraft, and hopefully your listeners will read Chapter 3 of the book. I get into a lot of illegals tradecraft. That's just one piece of it.
So after the nerve gas attack on the UK with the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, you say there was a unified response from European governments against Russian diplomats. Apparently, 150 were expelled from Russian embassies. Given that this is a problem that Russian embassy staff is spying, why do countries continue to still work with Russian?
Yeah, so I should say, like a detail in the book, Mike, though, the response was not immediate. It took a while. In the case of Litvinenko's poisoning with polonium in 2005, and when he died, 2005, 2006, nothing was really done. There was no repercussions for the Russian government to speak of, not from the UK, not from the United States. And so in 2018, when they tried to kill one of their former defectors, by the way, as I relate in the book, there was an unspoken, but an understanding. It might not have been written, but it was certainly spoken understanding, rather, that we would leave each other's spies alone, those that had been swapped in the trade. The illegals had children in the United States. They were concerned about their children being able to have their own lives, go travel the world. Some of them did return to Canada, by the way. Some of them fought to get their Canadian citizenship back. I don't know how they won that case, but they did, some of the children. So there was this understanding, leave them alone. So we leave them alone. We honor the understanding. What do the Russians do? They try to kill Skripal and his daughter. It shows you, again, dirty tricks, dirty bastards that they are. We can't trust them for anything, even when we try to work out spy swaps. And so in the case of Skripal, though, the reaction was slow. It took a long while. The actual formal report from the British government only came out a year or two ago. I referenced in the book, they had one of their citizens die. An innocent citizen did die, Dawn Sturgis, because her husband picked up the perfume bottle that the GRU recklessly tossed after they recklessly used a nerve agent to try to kill someone. By the way, why use a nerve agent? They want the West to know it's us, Russian intelligence. They could have just walked up to Sergei and his daughter. Sadly, they could have shot them or stabbed them or done. These were GRU assassins. But they used a nerve agent because they want the West to know it's us. And so, Mike, where I'm going with all this, the reaction from the West has been too slow. It took a long time. Yes, finally dozens of officers were PNG'd. And then after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, hundreds of Russian intelligence officers were kicked out, declared persona non grata across Europe. So that explains why they've had to turn to new tactics to fill in for, they don't have as many covered officers working in embassies, diplomatically covered. But yeah, the case of Skripal is illustrative. It's illustrative in many different ways.
To elaborate on that further, countries just needing to have the senior diplomat or resident there in country that they need to talk to the Russians, and that's why they haven't completely expelled, I guess, a Russian ambassador, things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I should state when we're talking about, we get it drifting into policy stuff a bit. My views are mine alone, don't represent CIA nor the U.S. government. It's always that way when discussing my book, but I'm supposed to state it always at some point. I can't explain why governments are allowing Russians still in representations. I am glad in the United States, and for us, the FBI and State Department shut down some of the Russian consulates, which I don't think we're doing anything except intelligence collection against the United States in San Francisco and Seattle. I think they finally closed the consulate in Houston. They were riddled with spies. They often had far more spies than they did any diplomats doing any real diplomatic work. They were just using them as platforms to attack our society and attack our democracy. So I'm glad a lot of them were shut down. As for other countries, Mike, I can't explain why they'll still let them in. Some countries like the Hungarians under Orban were very naive. Their own Hungarian press reported on during the election, and a record number of Russian intelligence officers were posted to that embassy, SVR and other officers, SVR, GRU, and otherwise. A record number were posted there. This is Hungarian intelligence services that was leaked in their media while Orban was president. So it goes to show it doesn't matter how friendly you are to brother Vladimir Putin, who Orban was all, bro with. The Russians still were spying the hell out of the Hungarians. Probably because of the very fact that Orban was so distrustful with the EU, they thought, well, we probably can't trust this guy either. There are no friends to the Russian intelligence services. They're going to spy the hell out of any government, any supposed ally they have, anybody trying to help them. It doesn't matter. This is zero-sum game for them, as I relate in detail a lot in my research and writings.
Moving on to Chapter 8, you talk about how the Russian Spetsnaz and Navy SEALs cross-trained together. Can you elaborate at all on how this came to fruition?
Yeah, I think Mike, it's okay, but that's a bit of an overstatement. They weren't really cross-training. So there was an exchange program. Yeah, what I related was an exchange program of one agency colleague of mine that mentioned he was able to go over there on a one-time exchange. I don't know that it ever happened again. And he was sort of able to observe, and then a GRU officer, Spetsnaz officer, I think, was sent to the Navy SEALs or other Tier 1 elements. It was kind of a one-time thing in the 90s when we were trying to see if we could have a real relationship and what we call liaison in the intelligence community. Even the military, you try to have good liaison relationships. Military attaché associations are a big part of that out in diplomatic communities. So anyway, what I related in the book, of course, was his assessment of the GRU. I won't spoil it for readers, but that was his assessment from that experience. And it wasn't very high in terms of their tactics. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, additionally, you talk about the sloppiness of Russian Spetsnaz and counterterrorism operations. Because of this, do you think that other African nations that employ like Wagner, some of the Spetsnaz forces, eventually stop military relations?
Unfortunately, no, it's growing, Mike. Unfortunately, good question. A lot of really good writing out there. Any of your readers that are interested in this or want to look at research on this for your undergrad, master's, or doctorate, look at the Center for Hybrid War in Europe or another institution, CEPA, Center for European Analysis. They've all done some great reporting lately on Russian hybrid war, something I've also written quite a bit about. As you know, Mike, it's in the book, chapter 10 especially, a lot about hybrid war. The Russians are trying to compensate for shortcomings in their own military, their own inability to carry out, to challenge NATO militarily necessarily. What they're trying to do is they're trying to engage in conflict just below the threshold of kinetic warfare, just below the threshold of NATO and Russia exchanging missiles with each other. And so this is hybrid war, and this is why they send these private military groups like Wagner sent abroad to support despotic regimes in Africa and prop up autocrats. And it helps Russia. Remember, every single one of those countries where they're doing that, one of them is Mali. They're heavily involved in Mali now, still doing it, even after Wagner collapsed, after Prigozhin's attempted mutiny. Remember, those elements were all absorbed in either the Russian military as proxies or new private security military groups, private mercenary groups, rather. So they're all over Africa. They're doing a lot of this, and they'll prop up these autocrats. Remember, each one of those is a vote in the UN. Each one of those countries. Each one of those Sometimes resource-rich African countries are a chance for Russians with graft, greed, bribing to steal resources. Literally, bribe a leader, help keep them in power, and then they get the gold or other gems or resources or whatever the hell they can steal and pilfer. So it's worth it for Russian intelligence, and they'll continue doing it.
Okay. Talking about active measures, since 2004, with the wave of orange in Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia, how have you seen active measures change? And was there anything unique about the RIS and how they tried to influence those environments?
Yeah, good question, Mike. It's, I believe, one of the most existential threats to democracies right now. And I really hope that your listeners and ROTC cadets that you work with and that y'all spend time looking at this. Information warfare, particularly cognitive AI, cognitive artificial intelligence warfare by the Russians and the Chinese both, is, I believe, the greatest threat against the United States right now and all democracies around the world. You look at upwards of 20 to 40% of all media, all content on the internet right now is AI generated. That's from people a lot smarter than me are saying that, and I believe them. And so what was done in 2016, when those social media trolling that I relate in my chapter on active measures, what they did largely by intelligence officers and proxies from organized crime, like an internet research agency that Prigozhin set up in 2016. Fact that they meddled in the election, by the way. It's not up for debate. The DNI report said it, the entire intelligence community report, the Senate Select Committee intelligence report, that Marco Rubio, as chairman of that committee, he signed off on it. He concurred on it too. It was a bipartisan report. So the fact is that they meddled, and they meddled not for or against any one individual candidate. They've meddled against our democracy to get Americans to distrust democracy. I speak at universities a lot. I did last month with a fairly large one. I won't say which one, but for other university students listening right now, this is a key point I'd like to leave you with. The Russians and Chinese want you to believe, the young generation in America, that our democracy doesn't work because they're cynical. They've never had free and fair elections. They don't believe they exist, and they believe they have the right to choose for their people. So Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, democracy is one of the only real threats to them. If their people ever get wind of the fact, wait a second, geez, well, we've been told it's not true. There are functioning democracies out there, and they're not perfect, and they have problems. By the way, Ukraine has problems with corruption. They know it. They're trying to fight it. But by God, the greatest threat to Vladimir Putin was the idea of a fully functioning democracy, rising democracy, trying to integrate into the EU on his border, Ukraine. He couldn't stand for that, and that's why he invaded in 2022. So yeah, active measures, information warfare, as the Russians have practiced for decades and decades, gone back through the Cold War. Mike, this is an old technique. It's not a new one. So Americans shouldn't be surprised of it. But it is the greatest threat, I believe, to our democracy today.
So, another question, sort of to end off, talking about your entrance into the CIA, when someone who knows a critical language like Russian, do you have to be 100% fluent?
Yes, let's end with some advice for those of you that are, already ROTC cadets. You're interested in the intelligence community. First of all, I commend you for wanting to serve your country. We need more than ever. We need young Americans willing to serve in our military and in uniform. And for the intelligence community, I was very honored to deploy to Afghanistan in my career. Deployed with CIA, but I was embedded with the Army Special Forces, and I honored that five of those gentlemen came to my book launch in New York City. So decades later, that's how close we stayed. So it is important. We need you all to serve your country. Here's the 3 pieces of advice I always give. Difficult languages. The harder the language, the better. While you're at a university, you need to distinguish your resume from thousands and tens of thousands of others. So Russian, Chinese, Arabic, the harder the language you can study, the better. It's okay to study Spanish or French or German too, but remember they're members of NATO. So, they're not adversaries of the United States. We need to study the languages of our adversaries. Like I did, I studied Russian because, as Russians say, "Хорошо знать, как думает свой противник." So it's important to know how your enemy thinks, or as Russians say, "Чем дышит человек." How does a person breathe, meaning what they think. So I hope the advice I give in the book is well taken, that it is important to know languages. Our own DDO, Mike Sulik, who wrote the foreword of the book, a great deputy director of operations, he says the same. We need languages. We need people to be experts in understanding other cultures, to be good spies. So study a language if you can. You don't need to achieve fluency. That can come later. CIA and other intelligence agencies just want to see you're willing to study a difficult language. Second piece of advice is what I related when I applied to the intelligence agencies in the 90s. I didn't get immediately the job I wanted to be a case officer. That came later. You have to apply wide and far. I give this advice all the time, and it's not listened to by a lot of university students. Please apply to a bunch of different agencies. There's really good ones out there. The Association of Former Intelligence Officers, AFIO, has a great career guide to intelligence. I'm going to send it to Mike that he can share with all of you. Put it in the episode notes even, Mike, if you like. So you're going to have to apply wide and far because we're not hiring as much for government right now. I think that'll change in a few years, but we're not hiring as many. And then the final piece of advice is you have to give it time. It takes at least a year or longer, and all the intelligence agencies will tell you that. So you can't wait until your senior year to apply. You have to be applying now. If you're graduating in 2027, you should be applying now. Look at the internships across the intelligence community. There's a lot of really good ones. FBI has one called Honors Internship Program. State Department has great paid and unpaid internships. I did one myself overseas in college. So those are my big pieces of advice. I hope that they'll be useful. Hope you all will consider the book. It's available on Amazon. It's a bestseller on 3 different categories on Amazon. And I really appreciate the chance to talk with you all, Mike. And I appreciate all of you that want to serve, and hope this is taken well-intentioned for those of you that do want to serve, and it's a help to you.
Definitely, sir. Thank you very much. We are extremely honored to have you on.
Great, Mike. It's been an honor. Thank you.